Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special Weedy Virtual Spotlight, Managing Consent in the Age of Interoperability, sponsored by Edifecs. It's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Day with Edifecs and Jim Caton with Accenture.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Appreciate everyone's time today. Hopefully this will be informative and get a lot of value out of it. So definitely as we go through the conversation, feel free to lob questions over within the chat session. Jim and I will try to address them if we can during it. If not, then we'll make sure we address at the tail end of the conversation. So again, my name is Kevin Day. I'm our Principal Business Advisor here at Edifecs. I also am a co-lead within the HL7 FAST accelerator on the consent management work group. Along with me is Jim Caton with Accenture. Jim, want to go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you. Appreciate your time today. Been with Accenture for the past dozen years and as an enterprise and solution architect, working primarily in the payer space. And prior to that, I worked in the behavioral healthcare human services as a CIO for 20 years, as well as for an electronic health records enterprise vendor. So good to be with you today.
So go ahead, Jim. Let's go ahead and go through the agenda real quick. So what we're going to do is Jim's going to kick it off by going through some of the important concepts, foundational concepts around consent management first. Once we lay that as a foundation, I'll jump into some industry perspectives around common challenges that health plans have and where I see it continuing to evolve. And then next, Jim will actually go through a reference architecture that we jointly have implemented at a joint client of ours. And that actually goes live next week. And then I'll circle back with a bit of salesmanship around one of the key aspects of that solution architecture on a new product offering Edifecs has released to the market. And then we'll open it up to the public Q&A and then wrap it up. So go ahead, Jim. You want to take it away?
Sure. So I know we have a large audience today and probably a wide variety of domain knowledge on this topic. So we want to kind of set the stage for the discussion with some of the important terms and concepts that are associated with consent. And for many of you, this may just be a remediation, but for some of you, this may be new information to kind of help to understand the aspects of consent that we have to deal with in the architecture. So we want to first talk about this from a perspective of what roles and types of persons are associated with consent. So from the payer perspective, we have subscribers. Those are obviously the people that own, excuse me, the plans through payer systems. Any of the dependents that are with them and on their plan are known as dependents, so they're attributable to those members. And then there's something called personal representatives. So that's a person who's acting on behalf of members. In the news, you may have heard about personal representatives who were denied access, when rightly they should have had that, and then the organization was fined for that. So there's a lot of legality around personal representatives, and conversely, there are bad actors who try to get access to PHI from members. So there's a lot of due diligence around the process for personal representatives. So this reference architecture that we're going to explain today does a lot around the efficiency of enabling the workflow around personal representatives, and we'll walk through that. We also have something called authorized users. So in some systems, that's just sharing your user ID and password, but we want to try and get away from that and actually have members authorize users who can look at their data and have them set up with separate logins. So this architecture also supports that. And then finally, we have just identified individuals. So these are folks who may come into a website and just maybe identify themselves for purposes of follow-up, but are not necessarily members. And it's great to be able to record that individual because if that individual eventually becomes a member or associated, then you have that kind of historical reference. I want to talk about consent now. And so there's the idea of two types of consent. Explicit consent is a consent that's created between the member who is granting it and then whoever they're granting it to, essentially the receiver of that. And explicit, it explicitly identifies who the two parties are. An implicit consent is one that is generated through a system, a consent system, but it's actually just the codification of policies. And then when the consent is generated, it's running off a rules engine and it's looking at the rules associated between the two parties, the one that's granting the consent and the one that's asking for the consent. And then it's calculating essentially what their level of consent is. So it's not a hard and fast stored as a consent, but it's stored as essentially it's dynamically generated on the fly. And for this system, you want to really kind of shade toward building out policies, consent policies that are enabled through implicit policies, because it cuts down on the amount of maintenance overall on the system. There's also the idea of internal and external consent. So internal consents is what we're going to be dealing with mostly today. And that's the consents that are generated within your organization and have to interoperate across multiple systems within your organization. External consents are those that are shared across organizations. And there are work groups and IGs out there right now that are striving hard to enable the interoperability of externalized consents and actionable, codifiable policies that can work across systems. So that's something that, is kind of in the works, and there are reference implementations of that, but they kind of they only go so far, and we'll kind of look at some of the issues with that. And then we have PHI classification. So we have this idea, you probably understand, about sensitive data. So that's kind of the data that HIPAA identifies as needing special safeguards and protections. And then non-sensitive data would be all of that PHI data that is not included in that sensitive data. So I gave the example there, of course, like psychotherapy notes and genetic information, pregnancy information. Okay, so we have kind of like the scope of consent. So within a consent system, you can have access to all of the PHI if it's as appropriate. That would be kind of known as full consent. So allowing a member to have access to all your PHI without limitation. So this example is a subscriber may be granted full access for a dependent minor's PHI. An example of a limited consent is that maybe as that minor ages to a mature minor, then there is a policy that kicks in and basically says, you can't see any sensitive information over a particular age, depending on what the rules are for that state. And then there, of course, is no access. So that might be a subscriber who has an adult dependent is not automatically granted. So the dependent would have to explicitly grant the access in order for the subscriber to see information. And then finally, we have this idea of granularity. So granularity is a set of categories that are broadly defined across PHI data and typically associated with terminology sets. So like test results, procedures, and those follow the code sets for those, such as like CPT. And so what you have is organizations who enable a set of categories and may allow their members to select the categories that they consent to. and therefore the underlying policy engine has to be able to understand the data as it's making that data available to the requestee, whether or not that that particular granular level of data has been consented to. Okay, I'd like to turn it back over to Kevin, who's going to tie some of these concepts together and kind of go through what are some of the challenges that we face in the industry. Kevin?
Yep, great, Jim. Thanks, appreciate it. So one of the things we want to start with is, kind of the lay of the land and it exists now. In the fact, from a perspective of the members. So the members interact, as we all know, with several various entities when they go through their care journey that all require sharing of PHI. Who doesn't go to their doctor's office and then sign 4 or 5 different consent forms, standard HIPAA consent around continuation of care, where your information can be shared with other service providers that are part of your care journey. We're all very accustomed to that. Go ahead, Jim. Go ahead, you want to advance for me? Those also involve not just individual service providers in that part of the relationship, but a number of other entities, including, of course, their own health plan or possibly other health plans. Where if you've got a co-insurance across multiple health plans, for instance, where PHI needs to be shared across all those. So from a member or patient's perspective, it's a pretty daunting task of consent and how they have to view it. So go ahead, Jim, if you could advance for me. So now one of those, of course, being the health plan itself. And the health plan has, of course, multiple means of storing PHI. Go ahead and advance out for me. So including having to communicate that PHI to a number of those same entities, either other health insurance plans or the service providers themselves, along with the member and in various sets of proxies that Jim talked about, be it a PR or an authorized users. So those communication channels, if you would, are having to deal with data coming in around associate with a member where the PHI is stored in a multitude of backend systems. Go ahead and advance for me. A couple of examples. Go ahead and build all that out for me. We'll just kind of go through them real quick. So all these should be pretty common to everybody. Of course, probably the primary one would be your claims adjudication system. So you've got, of course, adjudicated claims sitting in there. Case management, utilization management. Of course, we're also going to have data warehouses, be it a clinical data warehouse, a claims data warehouse. You're going to have PHI persisted in these data warehouse and proprietary formats. All those need to be communicated in a variety of different ways. And each of those communication channels, whether or not they're file feeds going out the door to an HIE, for instance, or another health plan, or via portal, such as a member portal, or a phone call conversation that a member or one of the authorized users phones in and has a conversation around sharing of PHI. Those all communication channels need to be conformant and to the same consent definitions that the individuals with those PHIs represent, and it gets encapsulated. So that is a lot of complexity that health plans have existing now. Go ahead and advance for me, Jim, please. Okay, so on top of that, so when we talk about consent, especially when we talk about implicit consent, Jim spoke about, that's a common aspect of that is basically state and federal data privacy laws that set that individual rights access to data is guaranteed. It's also restricted. All right, so go ahead and flesh that out, Jim. One of those, of course, is going to be state laws. California being, along with probably New York and Maryland, being 3 of the most stringent and controlled sets of state laws around data privacy, dealing with certain services that are rendered out there. The idea behind that being that the complexity is in the laws themselves, and the data privacy office within the health plans need to understand those and be able to encapsulate those in a uniform fashion that get applied to all those communication channels I just spoke about. So along with the state laws, of course, we're all very familiar recently. Go ahead, Jim, one more. Around the federal laws, that such as the 42 CFR Part 2 around substance abuse, right? So then that requires an explicit consent before any of that information could be shared. So laws like those are those that need to be encapsulated and then uniformly enforced. So, but they continue to evolve, not as substantially, but keep in mind businesses evolve. So an organization, a health plan that's predominantly have their book of business in one state now opens it up to another state. You then have to be able to quickly be able to encapsulate those state-specific data privacy laws in a computable manner. Go ahead, Jim. Go ahead one more for me. And as Jim mentioned earlier, he's probably referencing this slide. There was a recent publication by Health and Human Services just a couple of weeks ago around not only is it data being accessed and making sure that it's only accessible by the individual that it should be, also the speed of which that access is being granted is under scrutiny to ensure that if you do not provide timely access to PHI to individuals, fines will be there as well. So it's not just a matter of where PHI is being shared with individuals or organizations that should have been, it's also the timeliness behind the ability to share that information and access to that is really what the point of that one's about. Go ahead, Jim, go next one for me. So what's the situation we're at now? So as the backdrop, it's a very complex situation. And then more recently, over the last 4 years, with the adoption of FHIR through CMS regulations such as 9115 with the patient access API, and then more recently with the 57F, you have additional strains on health plans where you've got PHI being communicated in new communication manners. So you have these plethora of these APIs coming into board, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, as we all know. As FHIR continues to get more broadly adopted in the healthcare industry, where health plans are having to share PHI through FHIR-based interfaces, there's a growing need. Go ahead and advance for me. And it continues to evolve. There we go. So really what are we looking at? So what we're looking at is health plans needing to have a future state where they need to be able to provide and establish an enterprise-wide consent management infrastructure that supports the legacy or the existing PHI communication channels that we talked about, be it those files, the portals and all that, and whatever those formats that data is in, as well as the evolving world we're at now, which is the adoption of all these FHIR APIs. But it needs to be able to do that in a manner of which continues to uniformly apply both state and federal data privacy laws against all those communication channels. So whether it's a phone call, it's a FHIR API, or it's a file feed from a health plan to an HIE, for instance, data privacy laws need to be adhered to and need to be adhered to uniformly to make sure that our data privacy office will be able to sleep well at night. Go in advance for me, Jim, please. So what's this looking for? What we're looking to do is, as I mentioned, provide an enterprise-wide consent management infrastructure. And the goal, of course, would be from a patient's perspective or member's perspective, is be able to provide them more control over their data, giving them a peace of mind that their data privacy is being adhered to, even if they don't know what the laws are, but making sure that the information is only being shared with those organizations or individuals that is either legally has privileges to, or I make overt explicit consent grants to. Of course, we also want to be able to improve the efficiency, as Jim talked about, be able to manage these consents in a more, not just uniform, but more consistent fashion. And ultimately be able to empower the members and the patients and ultimately make them happier. And of course, that's a good thing. Having members happy, and it goes to our retention. Okay, go ahead, Jim. So last but not least is to say, ultimately, it's the data privacy office. Yes, it's the patient and the members that need to be we want to make sure are happy with what the services we provide them, but also internally, the consent office, the privacy office needs to be able to be ensured that they can sleep at night, that when they define the data privacy policies and requirements that the IT staff needs to implement throughout their infrastructure across all those communication channels, they are able to do that in a uniform and consistent fashion. So all the externalization of that PHI is uniformly applied to the consent definitions. Go ahead, Jim. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim to kind of walk you through the meat of the conversation, which is actually the architecture.
Thanks, Kevin. So as Kevin mentioned, there's a lot of challenges with being able to enable a consent, an enterprise-wide consent system, and have it meet all of the different use cases. So what the goal now is to kind of take you through a reference architecture and dig into the next level of detail on how would you go about architecting and what are the pieces and parts of this. We're also going to dig into some of the most prevalent use cases so that you can understand how the data will flow through these various systems. So I'm going to take you through the various components of the architecture just so you get an idea of what we're talking about. So we have, as Kevin mentioned, there's a variety of consumers and actors who have to interoperate with this consent solution. We have, as well as channels. So obviously one of the biggest ones is the member portal to support subscribers and dependents getting access to their data. It also has to support personal representatives and authorized users as well. Internally, you have help desks where those folks are talking to members and personal reps and other interested parties and have to have the ability to authenticate those people and what their consent levels are. Additionally, some companies have IVR, where you have the telephony options and being able to authenticate people through that. And then the next three are the APIs mandated by the CMS. So the Patient Access API, which was part of 9115, and then recently updated to FHIR in CMS 57. We have the Provider API, which is a new one. So now providers are going to be able to log into payers and get access to attributable members. And then the payer-to-payer, which has been updated to the FHIR standards, and also includes as well as dual coverage on an ongoing basis. Some of the pieces and parts for the kind of middleware that enable this. Obviously, we have an enrollment system for members, which is the system of record, and being able to ingest that data into the consent services. I've highlighted the enterprise identity relationship service because this is kind of a new piece where obviously many companies have enterprise master member indexes. But this one also pulls in the idea of building together in one repository data store all the different roles of identity and all of the different identities that go across all the different use cases within one store, as well as their relationships and the beginning and ending dates of those. The Enterprise Identity Mastering Service, that's one that there's a lot of homegrown systems that payers are using, or they're using any of the commercial systems. There's excellent identity mastering services, such as you probably heard of, like Initiate, Rialto, NextGate, Verato are some of the players in this area, InterSystems. FHIR, and then this is a FHIR-based solution. So the FHIR repository is actually so there's a service, a FHIR server that sits on top of that repository and enables the operations of querying the data and keeping it up to date. And then member consent services is a new piece where you have the ability to have a UI for the privacy office and other staff to be able to efficiently navigate all the consent use cases. So being able to enable personal representatives and all of the data and documents that have to flow through that. And there's also oftentimes a back and forth that happens with that. We'll see that. So having a UI to be able to enable that is important. And then as far as the data persistence goes, underlying the enterprise identity relationship service is a data store, which keeps all of these relationships and roles and member identifiers and all the identifiers that are needed, including FHIR IDs associated with any kind of identity in one place, which makes it easy to to then query and use that through multiple systems through APIs. All the organizations out there have lots of domain data warehouses with that data flowing into various other repositories. Most companies have CDRs, clinical data repositories. Applications individually have their own data stores. And it's mandated, obviously, to have a lot of the data flow into the FHIR repository and make it available. Some companies use FHIR repos, some companies use facades, that sit over the top of these ones. But US CDI, from a clinical perspective, is what's mandated by the government. And then finally, there's a consent store, which is kind of an extension of the FHIR consent that enables a lot of the capability that you're going to see. What I'd like to do now is be able to take you through, like at a tactical level, how the data flows through the architecture. So the first one that I want to talk about is when you have a newly identified person. So this is a non-member, and it's the simplest one, but it kind of introduces some of the way that the data would flow through. So you may have marketing websites where an individual can identify themselves and request more information. Once that comes in, it's going to go into what is central to this whole architecture, which is the enterprise identity and relationship service. So it's a set of microservices that are built to enable the flow of data through the various systems. The little symbols you see here are kind of indicative of this particular one is Kafka, but it's a pub sub, so that this is built on an event framework. And that's a very resilient framework because it allows you to basically not lose any events that are happening between the systems. It has restart capabilities, and it basically is very resilient. So the identity store is at the heart of really the ability to be able to keep all the multiple roles and identities and the multiple relationships that are possible across all the consent use cases. So, excuse me. So once the data comes in from the website, then it goes to an identity management system. So I mentioned some of those ones. That's your typical one, and the whatever data that was identified comes through. And then the enterprise identity service is responsible for mastering that data and figuring out, is this a person that we already know? And therefore return an identifier, which we call the UMPI, the Universal Member Identifier, or is it a new person and give a new one? Whatever that is, that data flows back through and is recorded into the identity store. And then this is an important concept, is that for every identity that's in here, that's a member or a non-member, you can also have a corresponding either person or related person or patient, depending on what the relationship is, in the FHIR domain. The other thing that's important here too to point out is that these are proxies. So the system's designed to allow the ability to swap in and swap out the underlying components. So if you want to change your identity management system, it shouldn't affect all the downstream systems. So by using a proxy call, then you can change just that one proxy and the rest of the whole system will operate. Same with the consent domain, where you're dealing with a proxy on top of the actual API calls to the underlying systems. And then finally, you can have a notification service where you can notify the person, that you've recorded them. Okay, so let's look at now one that's germane to consent. So this is a new member data flow. So this obviously starts with enrollment data coming in from your system of record. So you're going to have subscribers and dependent data coming in. When these systems start up, they're usually seeded with all of the members and all the dependents, and having this relationship and identity store seeded ahead of time by having it go through the identity service. And even on an ongoing basis, as new subscribers and dependents are added to the system, it follows the same pattern. So the subscriber identity and data comes in, they're identified through their member number, and the dependents always have a sub of the main subscriber number. So that kind of helps to build the relationship. It's evented into the identity management part of the solution. The individual that's sent over is mastered. We get back a UMPI. It's capable of maintaining a golden record. These systems also maintain manual work queues. So what happens is they use probabilistic matching. However, that's not always going to give you a 100% match on somebody. So where they may return a UMPI, they may also create a task in a manual system. And so there's a whole kind of workflow where where the organization has to monitor these tasks and these manual remediations and decide, is this a known member or is this a new member, and make that determination. So the higher the quality of the enterprise identity service they use here, the better the matching and the less manual work that you'll end up having to do. Also, it may turn out that there was prior linked or unlinked data. So that's where you have identities that should be the same person, and therefore they need to be linked. And the old identity has to be, or UMPI has to be retired. Or you may have a person that appears to have, let's say, two different plans, but they thought it was the same person, but it's actually a different person. So they have to be unlinked and assigned, and all of that. Those changes have to kind of flow through the system. So you get that through these commercial and usually homegrown identity systems. So once the data, the UMPI of that person is known, then they can be recorded into the master enterprise identity relationship store. And then again, you see this pattern where the data is then sent down to the consent domain, where the FHIR domain then will add these resources. So every patient starts off as a person. We also kind of built a special type of a patient called a master patient, because oftentimes you have a person who has multiple plans. So they may be a subscriber in one plan and a dependent in another. And so the way that FHIR handles that is that it has multiple patients. So each patient you can think of as a patient with a separate plan, either a subscriber or dependent in that. So that's the patient resource. The dependents are created in the coverage and linked through that and through their patient records through the coverage. The master patient supports the APIs where you may be able to come in through the API, like through a patient API, and hit the master patient, and then have the plans that are associated with that through the linked patients resources, and then allow them through just one query to be able to pull that data through. Okay. So then once that data is mastered or is created in the FHIR domain, then it comes back into the FHIR IDs, come back into the relationship store. So this is where I said one store has all the member information, all of their demographics, all of the role that they are, whether a member, subscriber, or any of the other relationships. It knows what the dates of those relationships are, and it knows their FHIR IDs, more importantly, so that you can come to this with one API call and then work within the consent system where the data has to be pulled out of the FHIR store. And then finally, oftentimes you want to make sure you want to use this enterprise identity service and enable your downstream data warehouses to use the mastering of the identity of these members. So the member UMPI can be pushed there. Okay. The next one is a new personal representative. So this one gets a little bit more complicated. So when we talked about kind of identity, this is where the due diligence really comes in for the privacy office, and being able to accurately and from a legal standpoint identify a personal representative and the relationship that they have with members. And this is from an internal perspective. When you think about it from an external perspective and you're sending consent to another system, then there's organizations like NIST who have created identity authentication levels. And they're suggesting authentication level 2, where there's a third party that can essentially verify the identity of a person. And so when you start looking at the external consents, are using those type of policies in order to enable external consents. But from internally, what we find is that most companies have websites where you can come in and you can apply to become a personal representative. So they enter their personal representative data. You typically have to upload your legal documentation. It's stored in a document repository, or it may be possible as well to mail the data in and work with a customer service rep who will take your personal representative data. But eventually that data then comes into a new type of a store, which is essentially saying this is the request for this type of a member, a personal representative. And so it's going to store all of the data about that requesting member, as well as the process and the status updates, so that the personal rep and the internal representatives can also know at any time where they are in the process. That is evented down to the consent domain, where that data is sent through and then calls into the member consent system, the manager. The data is then put into work queues. There's a UI, and this is really the main focus of the privacy office, where they're able to then use a system to efficiently essentially adjudicate this request. And like I said, oftentimes they may need more information. So it enables these status updates, which may be, requiring more information. So you see the data coming in, status updates going out, updating the status in the request store, and then, creating an event to notify the requesting personal rep that they may need more information to get back in touch, however. So eventually these requests are either approved or denied. If they're approved, then the PR decision comes through, and then it updates. It's going to be able to update and start the process of then identifying this person. So this person really, at the point when they're doing their request, hasn't been mastered yet. But once they are approved, then it does goes through the identity management system, and then it looks to see, do we know this person, or are they going to get assigned a new UMPI? Once that UMPI is assigned or known, then it comes back up, and it then updates the enterprise identity relationship store. So it then puts in that relationship. Not only does it create that personal representative as a record in the identity store, but also then the member is associated with them and what that role is. And then it then also uses that pattern of then, okay, we need to also put this into the Firestore. So they're pushing the personal rep data into the Firestore. It's creating a person, and then a new Fire resource, which is the related person. And that related person shows the relationship between the personal rep and the member as a patient. So, and they're generally, even if as a personal rep, you're generally granted access to all of the member's patient resources. So they do set up multiple patient resources. Like I said, if you're a subscriber in one case and a dependent in another, then the personal rep would have access to both of those. And then it sends back the Fire ID. So now the enterprise store, identity store, is now updated. And then finally, it updates the notification service. So it sends it out to the member to let them know that they can then access the data. Okay, so for an authorized user, this is the use case where members want to give folks that they know and are comfortable with access, but it's the request is not coming from a personal rep. It's just someone who the member is identifying as someone they want to help them, and we want to try and capture them as separate users in the system so we can have audibility of the records. So in this case, the member is working within the member portal, and there's ability for them to be able to indicate, excuse me, on their sharing screen that they want to have an authorized user. So they would fill out the information about an authorized user, the demographic information, that would then come into the member requests store. And the difference here is that when it goes down into the consent domain and the member consent manager, this is an automatic consent. So it will go in and write out of the system without having any user intervention at all. It's auto approved because essentially the member is saying, I know this person and I want to give them access. And they can indicate what level of access that they want to give. So it's auto approved. It updates the fact that it's auto approved here. And then it goes through the other familiar process steps where it then masters that person. It sends that authorized user data to the identities. It returns their UMPI, either known or unknown, and then passes back the UMPI. And then in that case, they're either created or updated in the enterprise identity store. So they may already exist. It may be a member, but now they're getting a new role as an authorized user. So this is the importance of the identity service and store, is that it can maintain these multiple relationships, that when you bring up person, they could literally be all of these roles at the same time. You could have one individual who is a subscriber, a dependent, a personal rep, and an authorized user. And that's the power of this kind of enterprise identity relationship service. And then after that, then they can be notified that they can then get access. Okay. And then this is the final one. This is where it kind of all comes together. So we've been keeping up to date these identities for the purpose of actually then being able to apply the consent. And so I have a couple examples here where you can have the portal login. So as part of this process, the PR or the AU is invited to essentially log in and, given a certain code, there are these authentication processes. So there's an initial authentication process that happens, and they may actually also come through and request access through the internal customer service tool, working and try to get data that way, but they would have to identify themselves. So once they establish their login, then it's able to then associate that login with their identity because you just saw prior, no matter what the use case is, we know who they are. And we associate then their login information in here. So then the next step from there is then it's able to send back to the portal the information about who this individual is and who their relationships are. And so they may want to, explore those relationships depending on who it is, the PR, the member, or the AU within the portal. Okay, and then so then from here, then what we're doing then is there'll be a request for consent data, and this is where the application of the consent really comes in. So the consent may be that there's two kinds of consent. They may want to change their consent with someone who they already have given access to. So it supports that type of consent. So a consent change, or it may be that they're just accessing data, and that data has to be filtered according to the consent. So potentially they could be sending non-filtered data into the engine here, and this is the consent service runtime. So it's calling a consent engine. It's accessing the consent store. Typically, it's between a requestee and a requestor. It looks up that consent. It tries to find out if there's, first of all, if there's an explicit consent, it's going to return that one. If there's not, it's going to try to apply the policy rules of the policy engine and check to see what the implicit consent, or excuse me, the implicit consent is, the derived consent. And then depending on what the need is for that consent, if they want to change it, it could be creating a new explicit consent in some cases, or it may be pulling data from the FHIR domain and then filtering that data according to the consent that it found prior, and then sending back that consent. So either implicit or explicit, and potentially filtered data with it. So it depends on the implementation here of your consent and how you want to do it. So this particular architecture supports both sending the consent, which is the consent details, which says like this, these two individuals have the following consent, and it may, and the definition of it will essentially say what they're allowed to access and at what level. And so that information, excuse me, can be passed on to a downstream system who may just want to use that and then use it to filter the data. Or the way this system operates, it can actually be sent the data, and then the data can be filtered and sent back, or it can pull the data from the FHIR store and send the filtered data based on the consent. So there's lots of implementation options with this reference architecture. It also does support, wrapping up, the CMS APIs. So the patient access API, the provider access, and the payer-to-payer API can all use the same consent system and enable the consented flow of data to those APIs. I did make a note down here. Most consents are implicit because it makes sense that you don't want to have to go in for every subscriber independent and build explicit consents, and that's where the power of a consent system that has the ability to elaborate policies as the definition of implicit consent is very, very important. So I'd like to turn it over to Kevin here to walk through a member consent service.
Great, thanks, Jim. Go ahead and advance. So just kind of real quickly, because I know we want to spend open up for additional questions I haven't been able to address online in chat. So a key part of what the infrastructure that we implemented that Jim's been talking about is the consent service itself. And Edifecs, we introduced a new product offering called the Edifecs, the member consent service. And it encapsulates two primary components, which is the design time or the administration function, of which you can go ahead and define. The data privacy office, for instance, can define what policies are. So, which, as I mentioned on chat, the enumeration of privacy laws, be it state or federal. So those policies can be defined, of which those implicit consents can automatically be created. So that's the administration side, including code sets that Jim talked about, the definition of code list groups such as sensitivity codes. You know, what exactly makes up behavioral health? Well, the privacy officer can go in there and define specifically what those code sets are, you know, be it HCPCS codes, ICD-10 codes, whatever the code system is. Even proprietary codes can all define and make up and be defined within a policy. And then the second part of that is, of course, going to be the runtime. So that comes in two flavors. So out of the box, it's integrated with our own FHIR gateway infrastructure. So for our clients who utilize our FHIR infrastructure, it's automatically embedded in or integrated in. So if there's a FHIR-based exchange via our gateway, the member consent runtime enforcement is automatically called. So those consents that are defined, they'll be filtered out. So the patient access API we were talking about, when those call in there, we go ahead through our own FHIR gateway, enforce that consent. And we understand that the requester is, let's say, an authorized user that Jim talked about. It will go ahead and enforce it. Now, go ahead, Jim, advance one more for me. It's important to note, though, however, go ahead, hit page down for me. Okay, is that along with MCS, member consent service is built purposely to also be open and be modal. What I mean by that is it's not conformed and bound to only our own fire infrastructure product line. It can be utilized and leveraged by any existing fire interface infrastructure that you have. It doesn't matter who that is. We natively support fire. And we also, it's important to note that it could be utilized, as the case in the client that Jim and I are referring to in this reference model, are used for non-fire base. So for instance, we've got a set of APIs that allow them to go in and get the consents associated with a particular member. So the consents are returned and what the privileges are. And then our client programmatically applies those to non-fire base. In this particular case, they have a proprietary member portal that they just stood up, and it's getting against their claims adjudication system. So that's being SQL calls. So they're hitting against those backend systems, retrieving the data, then doing API calls to MCS to get the consents based on who's actually at the portal and what members' data they're asking for. So it retrieves the consents, and then they programmatically apply the consents to then restrict the filtering of the data that's rendered up on their portal. So very important to note again that MCS it does support any vendors our own proprietary fire infrastructure can leverage it, and it can be leveraged for the filtering of non-fire based data as well. So let's go ahead and let's move forward. Jim, I think we're going to end there. Last but not least, this is Kevin's little public service announcement. So I'd strongly advise, along with communicating with your own internal compliance officers within your organization, if you looking to educate yourselves more around some of these terms and legalities around consent and privacy, definitely would start with the federal government at some of these websites. Health IT within HHS, it's got some good information. Of course, you're happy to use that QR code I put out there to guide you directly. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and open it up to any Q&As. There's Jim and I's contact information. If there are any questions that I haven't covered already during chat, please let me know. If not, we'll go ahead and we'll hang here for a couple more minutes and see if there's any additional questions that come in.
Or if you'd like to get more details on this, we're happy to come and talk to you in more detail about this architecture.
Absolutely.
There was a question there, Kevin, about implicit consents and why are those most of the ones, and it's essentially because it allows you to create a consent kind of framework that's based on rules versus the need for every subscriber to individually create an explicit consent for every dependent that they have. Instead, there are rules that govern that. And so those rules are codified into the policy system. And then when the subscriber goes to access a dependent's data, it looks at the rules, it looks at the age of the dependent, and it sees what policy applies. So for example, if they're mature minor, it's going to find out, okay, based on that dependent's age, they just, turned 13 or 14, I have to give them the subscriber limited access to the underlying data. So it returns that consent policy. That's an example.
Thanks, Jim. I'm not seeing any additional questions come in. Actually, one just jumped in from Rita. Let me look at it real quick. So can individuals or organizations create their own rules? Those predefined. Absolutely, within the Edifecs member consent service, it is designed for organizations. Specifically, it primarily would be your data privacy office to define what those policies are, as Jim mentioned. And that typically what we're seeing already within our initial set of implementations has been a combination of the privacy office along with analysts that can communicate with the IT staff. So for instance, if they're entering a new market, which is the case of one of our clients where they're going into a new state. So the data privacy office looks at those state regs around data privacy, and defines what the requirements are, those will be an analyst that'll go into the member consent service administration function and define what that policy is. They may include additional work with the IT staff to actually pull in specific code sets, right? So if they say that within this state, this new data privacy, the data privacy office determines that, okay, well, this new definition, we believe it means these specific diagnosis codes or procedure codes or places of service even now we're seeing are considered sensitive, and we're going to group them into this grouping. So they'll work with the IT staff to actually get the encapsulation of the actual code sets and the code values within the definition of that policy or that consent rule that Jim talked about. And again, the beauty of the implicit consents is you define those in those policies, and they're inherently applied to all members where data is being shared. So those at runtime. So you don't have to then pre-tag any like security tags, for instance, on your resources when you're loading them into your file repository, for instance, or if you need to, again, apply those to proprietary, we provide proprietary APIs that give you access to those, to that environment. You can either utilize our UIs to perform administration, or we actually have UIs or APIs to be able to set this up as well. So if you actually want to control the user experience, even on the data privacy office, you can do that. So the next question I
think
thought
also, Kevin, it's a very member forward design, where you're offering your members the ability to consent to a granular level. That's not always possible. It could be either sensitive or non-sensitive, but it could be any classification of data that they choose, where it can be identified by a code set. And the system allows you to set up essentially any type of, the question is, could it be non-HIPAA data? Theoretically, yeah, it could be non-HIPAA data as long as there's a code set that can be identified through the granular policy setup.
Great question. Unless there's any other questions, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up and turn it back over to you, Michael.
Kevin, Jim, thank you so much for an informative presentation and also handling all the questions in real time as they came. Folks, thank you very much for participating in this event, and thank you so much to our sponsor, Edifecs. Be sure to visit weedy.org and click on events for more information on our upcoming events. We have 2 additional events taking place this week alone, including, in addition to our spring conference taking place in May. Once again, Jim Caton with Accenture, Kevin Day with Edifecs. Thank you very much. We wish all of you to enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Stay safe.
you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.